All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual plant clinic. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to go over a few quick notes as always. For those of you who are regular attendees, just bear with me for a moment. This is a webinar style class rather than a Zoom meeting. So if you have questions during today's class with David, you'll type those questions into the Q&A box using your Zoom menu. There's also a chat button, which you are welcome to use. I monitor that as well. It's just a little bit more difficult for me to use that to follow questions as they come in. David will be taking questions at a few points throughout the call today, because I know we're handling a couple of topics related to the summer weather. We are recording today's class, so if you have to leave early for any reason, or if you want to share this with someone or just watch it again, this class should be available tomorrow around lunchtime, maybe in the afternoon. It's usually about 24 hours. And I think that is it on my end. David, thank you for joining us today. As always, I will let you get started.
Excellent. Well, good to see everybody, and thank you for joining us on today's virtual plant clinic. If you've attended the sessions before, you know I'd like to just take this opportunity to sort of share what's been going on at the plant clinic, what issues and questions and the type of things that we've been seeing there. Great opportunity to kind of share what's going on and always, hey, get to talk about what's happening in my world. But really, I like this to be a conversation. So anytime, please, put your questions into the chat box. Just put your questions, your ideas, anything goes on there. And so today we'll be talking about the hot, dry weather and how that's influencing our gardens, because that has been pretty much the topic of the summer. But like I said, you have this opportunity, of course, to put anything that's on your mind into that chat box. Also, Peggy asked me to remind everybody, it's not too early to be thinking about your fall vegetable crops. It seems a little strange here in mid-July, but if you're thinking about growing things like broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower and things that form a head, particularly if you're trying to grow from seed, that's something you might need to think about. And we just started getting some of our fall vegetable seeds in, and she's going to be offering some classes that goes into all this in more detail. But I thought I'd put that out as a little bit of a tease. And like I said, we're always thinking ahead in gardening. So with that, like I said, we're going to get started. The topic is talking about the influence of heat and drought in our gardens. The way I have this presentation structured is the first part, first several slides, I want to just talk about the physiological impacts, how plants react to hot, dry conditions. Because oftentimes we, understandably, we kind of view plants and think, hey, they're going to be behaving or feeling or acting like you or I behave, but plants don't. They're completely different organisms. And I kind of want to try to put a little bit of a view or a perspective of their world into that. Then we'll open up any questions you might have on that. And then I've got sort of the second part that starts showing some sort of real life or practical applications of what it does and what we've been seeing. So with that, I am going to start with a couple slides. So we know it's been hot, right? That's a story that we've all been living through and experiencing. And I'm starting with this picture from June 19th, because really, if you look back a little bit, and we forget things so easily, we had a really mild winter, and then consistent moisture throughout. April, suddenly the temperatures kind of dropped, and it was very cool and very wet through April and May. And at the end of May, we were almost 2 inches above our average rainfall. We had been having temperatures, hovering in the 60s to 70s, and peonies looked gorgeous, and hydrangeas never looked better. Iris were blooming, dogwood flowers, cherry blossoms, all that held up really nicely, because we were in March. We were worried, oh, the cherry blossoms are going to be bloomed out before the festival even gets here. Then that cool weather came in, kind of settled in really nice. And then suddenly June arrived, and it's like somebody went over there and flipped a switch. June turned out to be the driest June in the past 130 years since Weather Service has been keeping records. And we had extremely high temperatures going up, to sort of 90 to 100 degrees. And if you might remember, a lot of us, I had never heard of a heat dome before, but that was introduced into our language, which basically is like this dome. In my understanding, I think it was this, this hot air basically settles in, and because of the pressure systems and the circulations, it just basically stays put. And cooked us under these really high temperatures, right around, again, starting in mid-June, continuing into July. And really, it's only recently, I'm going to say even like this week, we've started to get a little bit of a break from that. So yes, extremely hot, extremely dry conditions. And it's also, even though we've had some rainstorms, we had some showers. If you look at Virginia, and this is where this little Maz, this is where I'm sitting right now at our Fair Oaks location, and you can see we were kind of right on this border between a severe drought and a drought and a moderate drought. So this website that I go to, again, it's fantastic. They keep these records. They are looking at groundwater levels. They're looking at river levels. They're looking at how it's influencing population, people. One of the things I learned from looking at this is there's 14 acres of corn in Fairfax. So I'm just saying that's kind of a weird thing, but they're looking at the influence of the availability of water in many different kind of aspects and sort of putting it together into this really comprehensive composite kind of thing. This data, you can see, this is the most current one. They update the status every week. So this is as of July 16. It's the most current one. But yes, it's welcome that we've had a little bit cooler temperatures, and we've had some rain showers in here, but we are still in what's considered a moderate to severe drought kind of conditions. So if you're wondering how hot is it, how dry is it, that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, you and me, we can run indoors, we can seek air conditioning, we can turn on our tap, we can find water. We have our ways of coping with these conditions. That's not an option that's available to plants. So plants, completely different organisms, but extremely well adapted to these dealing with these kind of environmental conditions. So essentially, when I say that, what plants do, what trees do, of course, they have the leaf surface that's out there, and that leaf surface is where the photosynthesis, the food production takes place, where basically, gas exchange takes place for that food production. They cool themselves with water, but they're stationary. They can't actually run and hide from the environment. They just have to adapt and acclimate to the conditions that are there. So I'm making some really, really broad generalizations here because we have, globally, there's over 300,000 different species of plants. And of course, they have adapted to all different kinds of environments, and different plants have different modes of adaptation to the weather. But if I take kind of this generalist view that's out there and say that most plants, most of our woody plants that grow in this kind of mid-Atlantic temperate region where we live, their optimal growth and temperature is about this 70 to 85 degrees. So their happy place, when you're out there like we were in that kind of April, May time period, their happy place, we're kind of in this kind of condition, and they're well adapted to those kind of environments and those kind of temperatures. But one of the things that happens is as those temperatures start to go up, this puts increasing stress on the plants. We start going into 90, 95, 100 degrees on up. We push these plants out of that comfort zone and into the limits. And when we start looking at temperatures reaching about 115 degrees, that's really starting to push them beyond those limits. And we kind of start seeing where it actually injures the plants, and we start seeing leaves die, and if that doesn't correct itself, eventually seeing plants die. So just imagine what happens when you're like under that heat dome conditions, when you have day after day after day of these 90 to 100 degree days. Your plants are definitely stressing out. you may not visibly see the symptoms, but that's what's happening to them. So as far as sort of the plant physiology goes, what they're doing, of course, is they're taking water in from the root system up and they lose it through the leaves through process of transpiration. So I'm always saying this kind of thing, and if I visit with the plant clinic, I always think of like, so with people, with animals, we have perspiration, right? So when we're outside, it starts to get hot, humidity starts to build up, we're uncomfortable. What do we do? We're doing perspiration, we start sweating, and then we get that evaporative cooling that comes off to help moderate our temperatures then and there. Well, trees, in some ways, they have this transpiration process where they're moving water nutrients up from the roots. This also is kind of like, I think of almost like the circulatory system, because that's moving out the leaves where they produce food and it transports and brings that food down in there. This water use also is what essentially is how the plant maintains its turgidity, its structure, and how it cools itself. So what I put in here, this little comment about saying, hey, if each increase of 18 degrees doubles the transpiration rate or the amount of water that's lost through that plant. So again, one of the first things that we start to see when we get these extremely high temperatures is usually the plants need more water to compensate for that. And not always, but it certainly did this year. But so heat and drought are separate, but closely related, closely interrelated kind of stresses that we see on plants. So the more water is kind of the obvious thing that goes on there. But the other thing that happens is as that water is diverted to helping to cool the plant, there is less water available for photosynthesis, less food production that goes on. So internally to the plant, I keep saying tree, plant, generalizing it, what's going to do when it starts getting out of that comfort zone, its photosynthetic rate starts to drop down, the growth starts to stop, and then we progress further into more visual symptoms. So this takes place again, the trees, like or plants, I keep saying there's all one integrated kind of organism. The roots are kind of feeling out moisture levels, they sense stress. The leaves, of course, are perfectly adapted to this kind of thing. When I think of a leaf, I look at that, it's like this solar panel. They're out there with maximizing, oftentimes maximizing sort of the surface area that's out there so they get the greatest exposure to the sunlight so they can maximize their photosynthesis and the food production that's in there. But all the surface area under high temperatures gets to be an issue too, because they have to keep it cool and sustain this going. If you looked inside a leaf, if you took a cross section of it like that, they have made these amazing adaptations so that they can withstand all this. If you think about on the inside of the leaf, again, plants are water. I mean, they have high percentage, like 95% water. Within this water is where we have this circulation system, the xylem and the phloem, this moving water and photosynthetes back and forth through the plant. This waxy cuticle layer that's on the upper surface of the leaf to help it conserve moisture and protect it against the elements. Usually on the underside of the leaf, we'll have these specialized structures they call the stomates, and they're surrounded with these guard cells. And essentially that's where they're going to open and close to allow for the regulation of gas exchange in there. So when this plant gets stressed, when it's starting to lose water under the high temperatures and aggravated by limited availability of water, these stomates close down, they shut down in an effort to conserve themselves. And again, that's where I start to say you don't actually see this happening, but now your plant has less water available. Visually, what you start to see, one of the most dramatic and first things, of course, is the plant starts to wilt. In the absence of water, it's not able for those cells to remain plump and turgid, and so they start to wilt. When you see a plant like this, and it's been hot and dry, it's pretty clear to me, I would think, oh, I need to water the plant. If it's in a pot or a container where it has this constricted root zone, it doesn't have that full expansive root zone that's out there. So now with the smaller root zone, the smaller volume of soil being elevated up out of the ground, more exposed to high temperatures and dry conditions and less water holding capacity, the wilting becomes more dramatic. I'm going into probably over detail on this because I figure you're a gardener, you're watching this. So this is an example of a plant that was brought to me at the clinic, and the customer was certain there's something wrong with the plant. And part of what I'm trying to always educate or teach people about with this is there is nothing wrong with the plant. This is a normal physiological response to a plant that's not getting enough water. Of the client in this case wasn't even a gardener. They just bought this because it was just a pretty ornament to put at the front door. But trying to explain this is what happens when a plant's not getting sufficient moisture. Probably clear to most of us as gardeners in there. But then what I did was I was able to take this plant, water so that it was completely saturated. And this is the same plant about 5 hours later. So again, if we catch it in time, they're amazingly resilient. They go to what we call a wilting point. It didn't get to the permanent wilting point, and just with a good amount of water and a few hours in the shade, here we are, this guy perks up. So a lot of times we talk about these physiological stresses the plant's under, and then it progresses to we start to see this wilting occur. And if we still don't get out there and rescue it, then it starts to lead to this kind of scorching development, or what I call leaf scorching. So this is a Coosa dogwood, again, well established and everything, but the location that it's planted in, it has a limited root zone around it. So there's a limited availability of water, and it's sandwiched in between two very tall kind of commercial buildings. And I'm convinced something about the location of this, the posture, I think the angle of the sun, all this, because you can see all these glass windows, while the other side is a similar construction. And I'm convinced that the way the light's reflecting all puts this particular tree under severe stress. And this is what happens. So the scorching, you can see how uniform and how consistent all this is around the outer edges of the leaf. This is what I call the transpiration rate, the rate at which it is losing water. It's losing water faster than it can be replenished. So we progress from wilting to this leaf scorch, and then it will get progressively worse from here if we don't address it. So I'm going to take a little pause right here before we get into kind of garden examples. See if this is making sense to everybody, or if you have any questions or comments you want to share.
Yeah, so we do have some questions related to a couple of different things. So I can just jump into the questions we've received so far if you like.
Yeah, let's
Then-
do that.
All right, and then just let me know when you're ready to move on. Everybody, please feel free to send in any questions you have, and we'll just take them until it's time to keep going. All right, so here's a watering question for you. For the past 6 years, we buy soaker hoses, and every year the squirrels and other critters make a hole in the hose, which is I've never heard of that happening before, and that's terrible. Any way to soak large gardens besides installing underground?
Oh, yeah,
Have you heard of that happening before?
oh, I have. Unfortunately, I've heard that story too often. Soaker hoses, I love soaker hoses, first of all. I mean, it's a very efficient, effective way of watering directly in soil. I'm like totally on board with soaker hoses. And in many situations, you can just bury them into the mulch layer, and 3, 5, 7 years of use is not at all unusual. I mean, that's kind of within the normal realm of expectation. So what you really have is a squirrel problem, and that is a tough one to deal with. Because I do have customers where they just have squirrels in the neighborhood and they go chewing and gnawing on them. So I don't know that I really have a good answer for you. You know, there are squirrel repellents, but then that becomes just another thing that you have to be sort of treating and putting out on a routine basis. Another thing that you can, that you have to deal with. Squirrels, I've had them chew on them year round, but you mentioned like the wintertime. If it really is just wintertime activity, again, you're not going to enjoy this. Nobody would. but it might be have something where you actually take the hoses up in the winter and put them back down for the summer during the time that's there. So anyway, that's probably not helpful. I don't really have a good answer for you. People do resort to trapping, but you're not allowed to relocate, wildlife beyond your property. So you can catch them in the front yard and let them go in the backyard. That does nothing. So anyway, yeah, you might have to look at just doing a different form of watering if we don't come up with a good solution.
Okay. Squirrels can be such a pain sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. These stilbees in my shade garden have suffered from the heat and lost most of their leaves. I like the look and wonder if there are more heat tolerant varieties. If not, are there any other perennials that have a similar look? Or
Yeah,
yep.
so Astilbe are definitely a kind of cool, moist plant. They're just not going to do well in really hot, dry environments. Oftentimes, what Astilbe will do though for you is they kind of go into a summer dormancy. This doesn't mean that the plants are dead, but under hot, dry conditions, the top of the plant basically shrivels and dies up. Uh, but as long as we don't go too extreme before, getting some moisture to them, they'll come back next spring and produce new growth for you. It's hard to get anything that's going to do quite that same kind of color, flower, texture. Uh, different plant, very, very different. But I really do like the Hikanakoa, the Japanese forest grass that we call it. It doesn't have a flower, but it's shade tolerant. It's got a very fine texture. You can get some that have sort of yellow leaves, green leaves, variegated leaves. So they can brighten up a shade garden. They can provide a nice fine leaf texture. They will tolerate, or they're actually kind of warm season grasses. So they're fine with the heat. Again, they're not going to do well with extreme drought, but they'll tolerate it. Again, it's not a flowering plant, but I love the Christmas fern. It's just our native Christmas fern. It's the evergreen one. Nice fine textured leaf, but you don't get the flowers. So couple suggestions. And if you came into the nursery and talked to our perennials people, I'm sure they'd come up with some other ideas.
Okay. Next question. Does the feels like temperature, like the heat index, due to humidity come into play when we're talking about the temperature of plants? Or should we be considering only the real temperature?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. Of course, because of the way plants are, higher humidities are a good thing. If you have, if I go back to my picture here, under low humidity conditions, so let's say bright sun, low humidity, high temperatures, I'm calling the transpiration rate, water that's being lost through these little stomates actually increases. So a higher humidity rating, which may be uncomfortable to you and me because we're perspiring more, higher humidity can actually aid in the plant or reduce its need for water. So for plants, high humidity is a good thing. For people, it's pretty uncomfortable. But I'm glad you brought this up because what can really affect it, and we see a lot of, is also if it's a breeze or wind goes through there, because now the wind is going through there. Plants, you step under a shade tree and you actually feel that cooling, that evaporative cooling. But if there's wind coming through, they can't maintain the high humidity levels in the canopy, and that puts a greater demand on it. So what I call, if you see the fire risk days, if you're a phone app or something to show you, because like the same conditions that risk fire, what they really don't want is dry conditions, hot conditions with a gentle breeze going. If you see fire warnings out, that's going to be a stressful day for plants. So yeah, that feels like reading is not much help to me in the garden. Great
Okay.
question. Let's do this. I'm going to just go a couple more slides and then we'll take a few more questions.
Yeah, can I ask you one question that was specifically on the Kousa dogwood from the last slide first? They
Sure.
just want to know if with sufficient water, if those leaves will recover or if that's permanent damage.
This is dead leaf tissue.
Okay, so that's permanent. That's not fixable.
Right. Well, of course they'll shed leaves and then they'll come back nice and green next year. But yeah, when you reach this point, so this green part of the leaf is still alive and functioning and photosynthesizing and transpiring. So this part of the leaf is totally functional, but this part, this brown, that's just dead leaf tissue, not serving any purpose. It's in there.
Okay.
First time I showed this picture, somebody said, "Oh, cool. They really like this." I'm like, "Oh, no, that's not the right reaction." Uh, but again, that emphasis, plants evolved out of water, right? Are very, very primitive ancient plants, basically with seaweed growing in an aquatic environment. And then they moved on to land. So plants are like 85 to 95% water. So again, we talked about heat drought, we talked about moisture drought, sort of the two play in between there. So when we get into these drought conditions, dry conditions, water is like a serious issue. These are a couple emails, I say, because I try to bring this really down to sort of like real life situations. And these are some of the things I find in my email inbox, just routinely. Um, a lot of words here, but I'll just quickly try to read it to you. So this spring we bought 2 Kwanzan cherries, and we plant them each in its own 36-inch by 36-inch steel planter. This was down in DC, urban environment that's there, uh, and I guess they're trying to buffer their home with a couple of trees. So these are two of the same tree. They're different trees, but one planted in the northwest, one planted in the southeast. You can see they're irrigated, basically same system, same amount, same time. But this tree on the southeast is thinning and shedding, whereas this tree seems to be holding up better. Well, it's a great example to me of what I'm going to call kind of the microclimate that's in here. Because they are new plants, they've got a restricted root zone, they're elevated up in the ground, and it's hot and it's dry. Water is absolutely critical to keeping these plants in good health. And you look at this one, you can say, okay, well, they've done a really nice job. I don't know the details of their irrigation system, but they've got it worked out pretty well. But over here in the southeast, of course, the southeast corners tend to be hotter. Even though when they say they get the same amount of sun, it's different through the day. So the northwest, we might be capturing some of the early day morning sun type thing, but the southeast tree is of course going to get that late afternoon sun. So same tree, same conditions, but this tree, basically, they're just going to have to increase the watering where they give it. I'm going to say increase the duration. I don't know how long their irrigation runs from, but let's pretend it's going for 20 minutes and it's doing that, every third day or every second day. I'm going to say, hey, let's try increasing it to like every 30, let run for 30 minutes instead of 20 or something like that. Again, I don't know all the specifics, but it's a good example of how the environment will influence how your plants perform and even some of the basics like we look at watering. So this was another, because basically in the month of June, my inbox is just full of dead plants. That's all I do during the month of June. And into July. Yeah, these are actually July pictures because that's when these kind of really rough conditions start showing up. So in this case, you can see the two topiary boxwoods sitting here side by side, same conditions, same plant, same environment, same care. The question is, why is one dead and one alive? So that's the information I was given, and looking at these pictures. So I looked at that and it's like, it is a little bit of a conundrum, a little bit of a question. Except I sort of the piece of information that was missing in here, and I was able was when I started looking back into the sales and purchase history and records on these plants. This little boxwood was planted in there 2 years ago. This little boxwood was planted last year in October. So what has happened in this case is, like we said, this one was planted in October, mild winter, consistent moisture, everything looked beautiful through all the way up until June. It starts to yellow up, and then by July, this thing's totally dead. because this plant does not have the same well-established root system as this one. And you look at, you can see how this is slightly larger. You can, if you look closer, this topiary has about 1 year additional growth over this one. And so this guy, being a new plant, doesn't have as much of a root system. And so that root system of being smaller, less developed, it just dried out. So I've been seeing plants that were installed last year that were dying out this summer, and nobody was connecting the dots on it. So again, I keep emphasizing this because again, we're, retail and emphasizing. So an existing plant, if you have a well-established tree, they might have a root system that goes way out beyond its drip line. So they have a greater reserve. They can pull moisture from a larger area. New plants, they come in pots or containers, and they have a much smaller area where they can actually get water from. This magnolia had been planted in the spring. So about a month ago, it's not doing well. They know the plants. We taught people magnolias shed leaves, right? But it might be normally like 5% shedding. This is excessive leaf drop that's in there. So this is definitely more of a stress reaction. So then the question comes in, well, they're watering it, but is it still meeting the goals? Is it sufficient? You can't tell by looking at the tree. Looking at the plant, overwatering and underwatering symptoms are very, very similar. It's even more difficult, I'm going to say, on an evergreen because evergreens don't always wilt like we do some of the other plants. You guys know a magnolia, southern magnolia, has got very rigid, thick, waxy leaf. So that's going to react with yellowing and shedding, and it's going to do that under either extreme. So we really, really emphasize checking the soil because we don't 100% know exactly what's going on in there. But when I say checking the soil, these are different moisture meters that I've experimented with and tried, and always trying to make this easier. You'll often hear me recommend, and if you just have a couple new trees, the best, easiest thing to me is use your fingers, where I'll just get a little hand trowel, just get a shovel, dig down there about 4 or 5 inches and feel the ground. You want it to feel like a wet sponge. If you look at this on a scale of sort of 1 to 10, where 1 is completely bone dry, 10 is completely 100% saturated. What we want to do is kind of, when you reach in there, I want to feel it somewhere around like that number 5, where it feels like a wet sponge, moist but not completely dry. I love this tool. Again, this is because I do so much of this. For me, it made sense to have this soil auger where actually I can punch this into the ground and I can pull a little soil plug and I can feel, sometimes it's wet up here, but dry down there. That's a lot of what I was running into this summer, is finding that people are watering, but they're not watering thoroughly. We had talked about, somebody called and asked about soaker hoses. I love soaker hoses, but a soaker hose basically takes about 4 or 5 hours, I think it is, to put out about a 1-inch amount of water. So if you're running a soaker hose and you want to do a deep watering, you have to let them run for several hours. Again, if you have an oscillating sprinkler that goes, again, these are all variable, but an oscillating sprinkler takes about 4 hours to put out 1 inch of water. Hand watering, you're delivering that water quicker. But my point is, I get a lot of people that were like putting a sprinkler on their plant, letting it run for 10 minutes and thinking that they're watering their plants. So really, in this case, I'm just saying, check the soil is there. And we're going to go back to questions here real quick. But I wanted to emphasize now, different plants, of course, respond and grow in different environments to these conditions differently. So most of our lawns, for example, lawns that we grow in this area, they're cool season plants. They are adapted to 50 to 75 degrees. Again, they're not even from this area. They came from Europe and Asia. So they're about that 50 to 75 degrees, 1 inch of water per week is their comfort zone. When it starts going 85, 95, 100 degrees, they will go into this kind of heat dormancy or summer dormancy that's there. I took these pictures in 2015. You can see there when we are in very hot, dry conditions. So what will happen is on a lawn that has deep, well-established roots, they can go into this dormancy and basically just stay dormant for usually 6 to even 8 weeks. And then we get a rainfall and they'll bounce right back. So that's why I say September 29, we had one day of really nice, good, cool rain. October 5, you can see that grass greening up again. So I don't feel like you have to be like constantly watering your lawn. You don't have to do that. It's a deep, well-established root system. You can just say, I don't want to spend the time, the money, or use my resources on the lawn. You can let it go into dormancy, and when the rains come, it comes back. Now, if it's not a well-established lawn, if you just put sod down, or you just seeded last fall, that's something you're going to have to keep watered, trying to get that 1 inch of water per week, which is a couple times a week. Well, who else loves hot, wet weather conditions? Things like Bermuda grass and crabgrass. These are warm season plants, warm season grasses. The hotter, the better. Bermuda grass doesn't really start growing till our temperatures hit 70, and it's thriving when temperatures hit, 90, right? So what's happening in a lot of our gardens is plants are stressed out, lawns are stressed out, they stop growing or they slow down, they get thin, but that allows a terrific opportunities that thrive, the weeds thrive under these hot, dry conditions. They start coming in, and so that becomes a little bit of a mess that's in there. Spider mites thrive in hot, dry conditions. So when you look at something like this is just a green bean leaf. When you look at the surface of it, this we call the stippled look. That's what spider mites do. They're generalists. Like I said, they'll get anything from green beans. We have people bringing euonymus in, rosemary, they'll get into almost anything that's in there. Get that stippled look. When we put it under a microscope, magnified, these are actually the mites. They bite the leaf, they suck the sap out of it, leading that discoloration. These eggs are tiny. All this is microscopic, we have to see. So as we go in summer, the weeds pick up, the insect or the mites pick up. This is a physiological stress. A lot of people know the blossom end rot. As fruit is developing, and I'm talking about like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, squash, they have to have a steady, consistent supply of calcium in that plant. So when we see this occurring, there's this knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, I have to add calcium. That can be a true statement, but what I find a lot of times it's also associated with drought conditions, because if that plant's under drought stress and the minerals in the water are not moving through there and they're not reaching the end of the fruit during development process, you get these kind of things. So I'm wrapping this up so we can take time for questions, but again, all these are stress factors. Remember, plants, they're about 90% water. They're taking up that through the roots. It's the lifeblood of the plant. That's where the minerals, the food, the photosynthates are that move the water it needs for its metabolism and production. If it's under stress, all that shuts down. And plus, they also are what kind of holds the plant together like a balloon and holds it plump and turgid. And it isn't enough, we start to see the wilting and the collapsing and stuff. So thank goodness we've had some rain. We're still not there yet, but keep an eye on things. You can allocate as far as who gets watered, who doesn't in there, but sort of try to set those priorities and keep an eye on this. Now with that, let's see if we have any other questions.
We do. All right. Just letting everybody know now, we probably won't get to all of these, but please, as always, feel free to follow up either by emailing me or David or calling your closest plant clinic or David at the Fair Oaks Plant Clinic.
Right. I get your message there. Saloon, make it quick. I'll try to be short in my answers.
All right. The first question, our landscaping company has pruned trees in high temperatures. What is the optimal temperature for pruning after trees and shrubs have bloomed and the blossoms have, okay, so this may apply to some trees and not others. After the blossoms have died, but before the buds have set. So maybe generally, is it too hot to prune right now if you need to prune?
So sometimes you just, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and you might have to do this. So if you looked at the pan, you look at here strictly on the kind of the physiology of the plant. I don't like to be pruning when it's 90 and 100 degrees out because what they're doing, if you look at, I'm going to use this crepe myrtle behind me as an example. These outer leaves, they're actually sheltering some of the interior growth that's here. So if I go in and prune this, and then I expose this interior growth to the full force of the extreme heat, that will cause damage to the plant. I know this for a fact because I did it during the drought. My garden's not always a thing of beauty. Sometimes it's an experiment, and I'm experimenting with hydrangeas and doing some summer pruning on them. And I'm also been studying and looking at this influence of heat that's on there. So it's not like a good idea. I'm not recommending. But I went out and did some pruning on oak leaf hydrangeas in the heat, removing some of those outer leaves. And sure enough, it's all sun scald and stress on the interior and stuff, and just sort of proving what I know to happen does in fact happen. So that's an example of where I'm experimenting, like I want to prune after flowering so that that plant will have an opportunity to recover and set buds and I get blooms next spring is one of my objectives. I also know that this is going to be stressful on the plant, but knowingly I do it anyway, not because it's a good thing. And we're going to see how it turns out. Stress, some sunburn on the plant. I still think it's going to recover. It's going to come back. I'm probably not really answering your question, but I would say if you can postpone it, if you can do it when it's overcast or the weather's a little more reasonable, that would be preferred. But you're kind of weighing your choices and going. Plants are amazingly forgiving. The good thing is, they'll survive, they'll recover, they'll go on from there as long as you keep them watered.
Sounds good. All
So
right,
much for
next
short.
question. This I think is a science term. So if the stomates
Yes.
are closed, is it bad to water plants in the heat of the day? Will it cause more damage than it will help?
If your plant needs water, water. Watering ideal time we all know is early morning because temperatures are cool. The plant hopefully has had the evening, cool temperatures and get hydrated and it's ready to face the day and it's definitely more efficient. But if a plant's in stress, if it's hot and it needs to be watered, don't make it wait. Go out there and water. It's not going to be harmful. It's only going to be helpful. It's less efficient because you're getting more evaporation and the plant's already in a stress condition. But you're not going to get burning or injury or damage to the plant. I had a customer in that exact situation. It's like, no, your plant's really dry. You need to go home and water. Think about yourself. If you're sitting over in the corner saying, I'm thirsty, what are you going to do? No, I'm just sorry. You're going to have to wait until this evening or tonight, tomorrow when it's cooler. No, go out and do it. If the plant certainly, if it's wilting, we're probably at that stress point and you want to water as soon as you're able to.
Okay. All right, next question covers a couple of people who are having issues with their hollies. One person says specifically a Hellery holly,
Right.
and she planted in early May, watered 2 to 3 times a week. Suddenly, at the end of June, they started to turn brown. Next person, my hollies are turning brown. I water them morning and night, but it didn't help for some of them. When are they beyond hope? So these are 2 people with issues with hollies.
Yeah. So just want to follow up in that last question. I may not have been complete. Is of course, stomates will open and close, so they might be closing down because of dry conditions. But when you get water into the plant, they will rapidly open and resume and go about their functions. So yeah, they'll go with what the conditions are. I'm gonna couple things on the hollies. One possibility I've had a lot of customers, and I'm not trying to say this is you, but I'm just saying I've talked to a lot of people that think they're watering the plant, but the root ball still dries out. So with a new plant, that's why I really emphasize that water needs to go directly on that root ball. If I buy a plant, like this coneflower, right? That's the root system. So that water needs to go right in here. You can have where the soil around this is moist, but the container or the root ball has dried out itself. So it's important that we water on there, and we want to water kind of slowly and deeply so that water has a chance to moisten the entire root zone, the entire soil profile that's in there. If you do a real thorough deep watering on that, even when it's 100 degrees out, on on a Japanese holly, that should be good for at least even 2 or 3 days. So sometimes that makes me think, well, maybe that water wasn't really getting all the way into that root zone that's in there. Something like we saw a fair amount of that happening. I'm gonna say, oh man, I'm going on too long here, but when we use this word overwatering, that really pertains to watering too frequently. It's not a one-time event. That's a chronic condition. So let's say if I really soak this root ball, saturate it, and I do that day after day after day, well, those roots also need oxygen. They need air to breathe and for respiration that's in there. So if that soil remains constantly saturated, that kind of swings us to the other side where it literally drowns. So that comes back to my whole thing. I don't know exactly what happened with the hollies there. It could have been like sometimes people like you're not getting enough water, and then you kind of the pendulum swings the other way where it's just excessively wet. If the stem is dry and brittle, it's dead, not coming back. If the stem of the plant, if you can scratch and it's still green and juicy in there, if it's still pliable in your hands, that tells me the buds are live and it's something that the plant may be able to recover. But I would try to check the soil, dig down in there, feel the root ball, and again, try to find that kind of wet sponge point.
Okay. All right. We really are kind of past time. So, but I have a couple of questions on crepe myrtles. So I want to make sure we get to those. The first crepe myrtle question is, this year the bark has started to dry out and come off. I'm not sure if this is heat related or not. Thank you. Is that something that they need to worry about?
No, probably not.
Okay.
Crepe myrtles develop an exfoliating, peeling bark, and it occurs more as the plant matures. So as it gets older, that becomes more and more pronounced, more dramatic, and more attractive. So I think that's probably just normal growth cycle.
Okay, sounds good. And then the next question, because I know crepe myrtles are in the middle of blooming right now. Do they need anything specific right now for flower blooming or fertilizing? Anything to look out for? Or are they can they handle this weather okay?
One thing I'm going to say be on the lookout for is, so now we're kind of in this warm, kind of overcast, frequent shower type of weather cycle right now. And I thought about, but I was going to go into, these are like ideal conditions for disease problems. So mildew, or crepe myrtles are somewhat susceptible to mildew. We're in a time period where mildew might flare up. It shows up as kind of like grayish, like mold or white mold on the leaves. If you start to see something like that, you might reach out to us for help on it. But no, they don't necessarily need any care beyond, if it's a new plant, keep an eye on the watering. Again, crepe myrtles are very heat and drought tolerant. They're came from India basically. So they should be thriving right now. Other than, I say, keep a lookout for mildew. And just, as always, just don't let it go to an extreme total dry point.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, David, we've got some more questions here on blueberries, hellebores, cucumber plants. I know we're past our normal time, so we can either take a couple more or we can go ahead and say, please feel free to
Let's
email us.
let's take these questions and I'll be
All
really
right.
short in my answers.
Okay. We'll go quick.
Right.
Okay, so if your hellebores look dry and brown, should you wait to cut them back until January or February? And should you continue hand watering the plant even though it looks dead right now?
I would visit the plant clinic. They should not look dry and brown.
The hellebores should not look dead. Okay.
No,
Okay.
so come into plant clinic, we'll need to talk in more detail, but I don't like to cut them back until, like I said, kind of that January, February time period. So let's
Okay.
look at that in more detail.
Okay, contact the plant clinic for that. Next question, cucumbers. Starting mid-July, some of my cucumber plants begin wilting, no visible root damage. By the end of summer, only 6 to 7 plants are still alive out of 20. Any idea why that happens?
Yeah, cucumbers, I think for everybody, just really kind of pooped out early this year. The extreme heat is just too much for them. I know they're a summer crop, but I didn't have time to go into it, but uh problems with pollination and fruit set and fruit development, stress on the plant in my book is like just cucumbers checked out early this year. Mine, I've given up on them. I'm looking for it. I'm just going to do some fall crops.
Okay. All right. This is for blueberries, but she said applies to other perennials as well. So the question is, we have a lot of blueberry plants. Some of them are 10 years, some of them are 50 years old. They have a bunch though that are 2 to 3 years old that are browning and dying back this year. Does it make sense to cut those plants that are dying back? Should they cut them back, and will that help them heal from the heat and the drought at a later point? Would that help them survive, or is it too late for those plants?
Well, it sounds like they're not completely dead. I would just prune out what's dead. I don't like to prune out any live growth. So even if you have stems that have shed leaves, but if they're still alive, they're juicy, pliable, and they still have buds on them, I would leave that on there. No, cutting back a plant that's already stressed actually adds to its stress. So you cut dead stuff out of it. You can thin out, some old canes or something that were dead or going anyway. But if it's anything that's alive, just leave it alone and do the best you can. Get some water for the plant.
Okay, gotcha. We've had one more. This is our last one. I'm not sure what this is. Should we keep treating for CMBS, or is the worst of it over?
Treating for what was that?
EMBS.
Oh, crepe myrtle bark scale.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So we know of, we think there's about 3 generations a year of those. So they're going to be active throughout the entire summer. It's going to depend a little bit on how you're treating that. We also, one of the things is we've been seeing a lot of natural predators, what we call the twice-stabbed ladybug beetle, which is I think it's pretty much a native ladybug insect, but we've seen a lot of them coming in and providing some natural biological control. So again, I'd love to see samples of that. Send me some pictures. Talk about more detail, because I don't like to treat unless it's kind of the question you have, is it necessary? I want to see what the population levels are like. Do we have any natural predators? What your previous history has been, and kind of make, case by case decisions on that. But they're still out there, they're still active, and there's still another generation ahead to come.
All right. Okay. Well, that's the last of our questions. Thanks for doing that. Thanks everybody. Appreciate the comments. Well, do you have anything you want to wrap up with before we close?
Other than I got off a little off on my every 2-week schedule, so we're going to come back again next Thursday.
Yep.
Yeah,
we will be back next Thursday, everybody. So keep an eye out for an email on that topic. And I'll add, while we're at it, we're starting to get our fall schedule onto the website. So keep an eye out there. We're starting to add classes for September and October. Thank you, David. As always, have a good afternoon, everybody.
Hope to see everybody next week.
All righty. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.